Best Coordinator at the Center. Welcome to the 2022 Shutdown Restart Summit. Our theme this year is Shutdown Restart, and we chose this theme because it's reflective of the times that many of us are living through, beginning with the COVID-19 pandemic truly shifting and shaking up our culture and our practices. Now is the time to restart or to think about how we can reboot, reimagine, and reconsider some of our college practices for the betterment of student success. So I, for one, am very excited about our conversations today around becoming diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders, because we're all leaders in our own right, in our own spheres of influence. We will be hearing from our keynote speaker, Whitney White, author of the 5 Essential Competencies of Effective Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Leaders Guidebook. We will also hear from our guest panelist, Ken James, Chief Diversity Officer of Muskegon Community College, as well as Latoya Booker, Executive Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Davenport University. So if you're not excited, this is the moment where you ramp up your excitement, because we are going to have some dynamic discussion. Before you, you will see our agenda and how we're going to spend our time together this afternoon. I would like to take the opportunity to welcome everyone joining us live today. You can go ahead and place your name, your title, and the name of your college or organization in the chat, just so we have an opportunity to get familiar with one another as we are all coming together to learn together. This is an opportunity for us to grow collectively. While you're engaging in the chat, I would like to share that our keynote speaker and panelists will be speaking to the ways that all of us can become diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders in our spheres of influence. And we specifically chose to begin the summit with a topic specific to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we believe that matters of DE&I involve everyone at our institution. This topic is for those who are familiar and heavily involved in this work, but those who are also growing in their DE&I journey. So all are welcome. During this session, I hope that one of your key takeaways is that this work is not only of the responsibility of our campus or organizational leaders, those in HR or those with specific DE&I titles, but that it's specific to everyone who chose to say yes to their organization, everyone who chose to say yes to student success, everyone who chose to say yes to improving higher education as a whole. We're trying something new this year with our summit. We have developed a booklet that will allow for you to take down any aha moments, highlights, or notes or key takeaways that you have from any of our amazing summit sessions. So on this slide, you will see a picture of the summit website. On the website, you can go, and next to the registration link, you will locate the booklet that accompanies our session this year. In that booklet, you will find a note-taking section. You will also see a section for our speed networking opportunity, which will happen after our summit discussion, our main summit speaking our speaking portion of the summit. And you can jot down the names of those who you spoke with in chat or in your speed networking group. Now I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome and thank our panelists, Ken James and Latoya Booker, for joining us today. We appreciate both of you for your willingness to share your thoughts, your experience, and your expertise this afternoon. Following our keynote address, we will hear from both Ken and Latoya in our panel discussion. As questions arise, and I'm believing that many questions will come up because we're all learning and growing together. So again, as your questions come up, please share them in the chat and we will answer them at that time. I would also like to thank and introduce our keynote speaker, Whitney White. In the chat, you can go ahead and put in your round of applause or share your emoji icons as we collectively welcome our keynote speaker, Whitney White. Whitney has over 10 years of experience utilizing best practices to develop, lead, market, and implement corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies, programs, and events. Whitney has a proven track record of navigating through complex problems, analyzing processes, synthesizing data, and driving towards solutions. Additionally, She is the author of 5 Essential Competencies of Effective Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Leaders, a guidebook that documents what leaders need to know and be able to do to elevate their DE&I efforts. Since joining Marsh McLennan Agency in April 2022, Whitney has leveraged her skills to enhance the value proposition of the MMA-MI health and benefits practice by understanding and applying leading-edge thinking around employee culture and DE&I strategy. She utilizes consulting and process improvement methodology to help MMA clients develop and implement key strategies to advance culture and DE&I integration within their organizations. Prior to joining MMA, Whitney was the Director of Employer Engagement with Talent 2025. In this role, she worked with CEOs, human resource leaders, and diversity officers from more than 100 companies in West Michigan to lead regional diversity initiatives, as well as support talent attraction, retention, and development efforts. Whitney is a graduate of Grand Valley State University with the Bachelor of Science degree in Criminal Justice from and has completed graduate level courses in Public Administration, Human Resources, and Public Policy. She is a certified facilitator for implicit bias and cultural intelligence and a certified diversity and inclusion recruiter. She has completed DE&I trainings on leadership, inclusive workplace culture, belonging, healing, racism, cultural intelligence, cultural competency, and emotional intelligence. Whitney is a Grand Rapids, Michigan native, but currently resides in Houston, Texas. In her free time, she enjoys spending time with family, exploring Houston, and dining at new restaurants. With that amazing and impressive introduction, I humbly welcome you, Whitney White, to speak at the 2022 MCSS Student Success Summit. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction. It is an honor and a privilege to be here. I was thrilled to see the high attendance and participation. I see all of the comments in the chat and the introductions. I want to encourage you all to keep that energy going throughout the next hour and a half that we all spend together. So now I am going to start sharing my screen to talk about our topic of the hour, which is D&I essential leadership competencies. So during our time together, I really want to help establish a solid foundation. So we are going to review 5 essential leadership competencies that are, of course, applicable to DEI leaders, but then also everyone else within an organization too, because I really appreciated Precious's introductory remarks where we all have a role to play in advancing diversity and inclusion. As she mentioned, if you have questions throughout this keynote or throughout the panel, please enter them into the chat box. Some time is reserved for us to, visit your Q&A sessions because this is about you. We want to make sure that you get the most out of this experience as well. So Precious did a really good job introducing me based on my bio. I'm just really excited to be here because I am passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So of course, helping organizations to advance their efforts, create a meaningful strategy, and then actually see impact, but then also helping communities. And I think the role that a majority of you all play has a really big impact on our communities. So of course, I've gone through a lot of trainings, but I'm passionate about this topic as well. So just another reason I'm excited to be here. And the foundation of this content is really related to the guidebook that Precious mentioned. So the 5 essential leadership competencies, right, of effective diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders. And we really wanted to help create a resource which is designed to be a free resource to employers in West Michigan to help them on their efforts. Because there's so many resources that exist about the business case for DEI, or maybe even the moral case, as there has, of course, been an increase in the social justice movement after, the repeated instances in the news of maybe police brutality or just unfair treatment or even discrimination in employment. But there are not a ton of resources that exist around what do I need to know and be able to do if I want to really advance this work. So that was the purpose of this guidebook. I wonder, just kind of by show of hands or entering something in the chat, have you heard of this guidebook prior to today? I hope so. It's been circulated around West Michigan in different networks and circles, and a majority of people in the call may have even helped with that. So yeah, let us know if you've heard of this guidebook and this resource. This resource would not have been possible without the 15 contributing authors that you see here. So the contributing authors really served as like a sounding board. I had the privilege of interviewing them. They provided some candid feedback. They respectfully challenge things in the book to make sure that the important topics were covered. And I have the privilege of being joined today by both Latoya Booker and then also Ken James. So you'll be able to hear from them a little bit later in the presentation. But I just said this to say the contributors of the guidebook represent various dimensions of diversity. So whether it's race, age, gender, sexual orientation, but then also various industry sectors were represented here. So there is a lot of collective wisdom in the guidebook. And the next thing I want to share is just the foundation, right? So these individual competencies that we are going to talk more about today, they are personal characteristics, knowledge, planning, leading, and communication. And I'm actually going to provide some definitions later on, but this is a high level overview, kind of what we're going to talk about after we establish this solid foundation. And when we talk about the foundation, one of the first things that I like to lead with is that, of course, diversity and inclusion, equity, all of these topics can be very hard to discuss in the workplace, but especially to lead in the workplace. And that could be for various reasons. A majority of them are listed on the screen here, but for the most part, it makes people uncomfortable. You know, it can cause people to be defensive. It causes a lot of self-reflection and awareness. But oftentimes we also don't want to say the wrong thing. We don't want to offend people. We have good intentions, but that's not always portrayed when we have these conversations. So another important thing to think about is just that everyone deserves a voice. So you have to really engage everyone within your organization, everyone from the C-suite to the frontline staff when we think about advancing these efforts. We like to talk a lot about leadership in this space, how diversity and inclusion, like your efforts really have to be championed by the CEO, by the executives, by the C-suite, and we don't want to ignore that when we have this conversation. So in the guidebook, you'll find that we created this checklist for CEOs because the guidebook is really framed to talk about what does a DEI officer need to be able to do? But we can't put all the responsibility on a DEI officer because we all have a role to play. And the leadership is really the people who kind of have the largest voice, I would say. They have access to the resources. They can impact that change management. So there are a few things that we wanted to call out from a leadership perspective as we get started here. So assessing your organization and knowing your why, that top-down leadership that creates shared accountability, but then also positioning the DEI efforts and your team for success. Once you do all those things, you'll be able to better embed DEI into the organization so that it's really seen as the way that we do things instead of just a check the box initiative or just one program or one initiative. Those things really lead to sustainability, which we'll talk about more in just a moment. Common terms that we like to discuss when having these conversations are, of course, the equality versus equity, because equality is really giving everybody the same thing and hoping that it's what they need to succeed or to thrive in the workplace. But our approach is to more focus on equity. So focusing on fairness and really tailoring your approach to give everyone the tools and resources that they need to be successful. So that could involve, tailoring things on a case-by-case basis to make sure that you're meeting the needs of the people you serve. And I know that I may be going through this really quickly, but all this content is available in the guidebook, which you all may be able to download after the session. So we'll be sure to share those links as well. Another important thing to think about as related to, really having a positive impact in the DEI space is that you really have to impact both people and policies and procedures to see those positive outcomes. So you need, of course, competent leaders, but you also need an engaged workforce, a diverse workforce. You have to have that commitment to DEI within various levels. You have to approach things with a growth mindset and then really have this drive to improve. And then when we think about things from like the policy, practice, procedure standpoint, you really have to touch every aspect of the organization if you want to lead to this systemic change or the scalable change. So that can include where you source your talent from, but then also things like procurement. How do you spend your money? How do you develop your talent, your marketing, your branding? How inclusive are you? And then even the corporate social responsibility for where you're volunteering and, spending time and money outside of work. So all of that matters if an organization really wants to see those positive outcomes in regards to increased diversity, increased employee engagement, collaboration, profitability, and then overall equity, which should really be the goal of all organizations, who are taking a part in this work, to increase those equitable outcomes, increase that fairness, increase access for everyone to have those opportunities to thrive. So now we are going to hop into our first poll question of the session, and we want to hear from you. So when discussing DE&I at work, what is your greatest communication challenge? Lack of knowledge or experience, unsure if the audience will be receptive, difficulty tailoring your message, afraid to offend people, or all of the above? You should see the poll on your screen. Feel free to close that out when we get a good number of responses.
All right, thanks to the 80% of people who've participated, I'll give it another 10 seconds.
Okay.
Whitney, can you see the results?
I can, perfect. I'm just going to drag them over so that they don't obstruct the PowerPoint. I'm not sure if it was there. Thank you so much. So the poll has closed. The majority of respondents at 35% said all of the above. And next after that, 24%, unsure if the audience will be receptive. And that was followed by 16% of people saying lack of knowledge and or experience with certain topics. So thank you all for taking the time to participate in that poll. We of course want the session to be as interactive as possible, but that could also be helpful for us as we enter the panel and start to provide feedback and comments so that you all can get the most out of this session. So next, we will jump into the 5 competencies that I shared earlier. We like to start with personal characteristics, and that is really because there are a certain set of attributes that make a person more effective when leading DEI work. So those are centered around being authentic, curious, determined, and resilient. So on this slide, on the left, you'll see a series of competency statements. So each section that we do will have between 3 and 5 statements. And then on the right side of the screen, those will actually be application examples. So how does this show up in the workforce? How do I actually apply this information in my daily job? So I know there's a lot of text on the screen, but I'm really just going to highlight those competency statements. And once we get into the panel, Ken and Latoya will provide some real life examples about how to utilize these. So when we think about the first one, which is personal characteristics, being self-aware is key when doing this work. So you have to understand your own cultural influences, your values, your identities, what type of things trigger you, make you uncomfortable, make you defensive. And then also, how are you situated within your organization, your community, and the world? This work requires you to be resilient, so you have to continuously push forward even when encountering obstacles or lack of support. Because in this DEI space, there's often, some people who are here with you cheerleading, we need to do more faster. Some people are kind of just getting the hang of things or just kind of seeing the importance. But then you also have to know that there are going to be some people who do not care about it. DEI does not impact me. I've gotten, 30 years in life, 50 years in life without having to think about this. Why do I need to care now? That's their problem, not my problem, right? So you have to expect that resistance when you're doing this work. But then also being authentic in your efforts. You have to be a catalyst, willing to be innovative and spark change within your organization. But then there's also this really important factor of being relationship oriented, because oftentimes when we do this work, we may not have positional authority over anyone. So people are connecting with us or willing to have the conversation with us or be uncomfortable with us because of this relationship that we built with them around authenticity and then also trust as well. The next competency is knowledge. So doing this work requires you to have some foundational understanding of the multiple dimensions of diversity, but then also those definitions that we talked about earlier, so like equity and inclusion. But you also have to be willing to engage with different people, right? The language is always changing. You have to be able to do some research, figure out what those best practices are. And how do you do that? So in order to build your knowledge, you have to develop this content knowledge through various trainings, research, and kind of connecting with people. So of course, there are some foundational things like bias. Oftentimes this work starts with the unconscious bias training, but then also cultural competence. So understanding how your values may differ from other people and what research or knowledge you may need to be able to better work across difference. And then I would say the systemic things are very important too, especially in our current era of everything going on in the world. The second thing here says create personal knowledge networks. And that is so important because oftentimes we gravitate towards people who look like us, people who are in the same position as us, but we all know that we can learn so much when we talk to people who are different than us. So different industries, maybe a different race, a different educational background, different socioeconomic background, all of those things matter when you are building your network to learn more about this space. The third thing here says research DEI standards and best practices, especially those that are relevant to your industry. So in the guidebook, there are actually some standards that are applicable to higher education. Some of the other industries are not as farther along, but there are some things that are, best practices that can be applied to every industry sector. And then in the guidebook, we also include a list of topics. So many of you may be reading this thinking, well, where do I start? There's so much. And you talked about bias and cultural competence, but what else? So we just, of course, like to provide as much resources as many resources as possible to get you started on your journey here. I'll pause there to see if there are any questions. There was a lot of stuff in chat. All right. No questions yet. So good. I'll keep us pushing forward. The third competency is around planning. And when we think about planning, it's not a product, but a process. So during this process, we really want you to envision your ideal future state and then develop specific plans, strategies, and actions to achieve it. So when we think about planning, it has to be collaborative, right? So integrate your company's DEI vision and tactics into the overall strategic plan. Because as we talked about earlier, this is how you lead to sustainability, right? It has to be embedded in some things. There has to be accountability. There has to be, the leaders dedicating time, energy, and resources into this. But another recommendation is, of course, to assess the current state of your organization. So before you can even think about creating goals or metrics, you have to understand where you are from both the demographic standpoint, but then also the attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions of your existing workforce. So, there's some examples here about some things that you can measure and how you can go about collecting that information. And after you have that current state assessment done, that's when you really want to design, implement, and manage your program. So these different programs and initiatives that are going to help you reach your goals. And then the fourth thing here is just creating that shared DEI culture across the organization. Because often within an organization, the leader's perception is different than the middle manager's perception, and that's different than the frontline worker's perception, right? So you have to figure out what those shared values are and how you're going to communicate them and what work needs to be done to create that culture of inclusion, welcoming, and belonging where everyone feels like they can thrive there. The second to last is actually leading. So when we think about leading, of course, that requires that business acumen and that political savvy to really be able to navigate your organization. And it involves being able to influence people. So to shift those mindsets, to start solving problems, disrupting any programs or policies in place that might be leading to bias unintentionally. And some of those competency statements around leading. The first one is securing that CEO level support for DE&I. The second one is around negotiating the needed level of autonomy to make changes, because you have to once again be able to lead and not just manage things. Gaining followership through different levels of the organization, but then also consulting and cooperating with different stakeholders to execute that strategic plan, because it's a really collaborative approach to advancing DEI. People have to know that my voice matters. If I share something with you, you'll actually listen to it, incorporate it where it makes sense. And people want to be a part of the process of leading to change. They don't want to just be told what to do. So collaborating with community partners for sourcing, engagement, philanthropy, all of those things make sense with leading. And the last thing is actually communication. So the last competency. So this involves listening to others to receive information, but then also speaking to them. It could, involve those one-on-one conversations, but it could be a group presentation. It could be a board presentation. So really be able to process information and analyze it in a way that makes sense so that you can convey whatever message you are trying to convey to your audience. So some of the key competency statements around communication: communicate with tact and professionalism. So just remember that you're going to have to tailor your approach if you are talking to executives versus talking to frontline staff. Executives may say, hey, I have 20 minutes for you. Give me the, the cliff notes. What are the most important things I need to know? But there could be someone else that you're talking to where they have an hour to spend with you. They want to walk through the whole process of, well, how did you end up here? What do I need to do? What is my role to play in this? So, really be able to tailor your approach using various methods of communication is important here. But then also articulating a compelling vision, business case, and moral case as an organizational imperative. So when we consult with clients and organizations, of course, we touch on the moral case, but then we also had to say demographics are changing. By the year of 2040, the US Census predicts that the majority group will then be the minority group. Think about the spending power of different demographics, whether it's women, whether it is, LGBTQ community, people of color. The spending power matters from a business perspective. But then also we want to, of course, encourage you to facilitate these bold conversations. So, depending on what's going on in the news, you may have conversations about race happening at work. We want to encourage you to embrace those conversations and create a safe space where people feel like they can talk about it in a respectful way without fear of retaliation. And then part of that is also using storytelling and other creative approaches to connect with people, to educate, and to inspire. So that brings me to the end of the 5 competencies. Once again, it was a very high level overview, so I'm sorry for going through things so quickly, but all the information is available to you online and after the session. And then another benefit of doing it that way is just like you can get your questions answered by some of the industry practitioners and leaders in West Michigan. So now I'm just going to pause there. I see that some things were coming through in chat, which is great, but I am thrilled to stop here to share with you all that Ken and Latoya are now going to join the conversation. I actually met them and have had the privilege of working with them for at least 3 years through my previous employer. I learned something every time I talk to them. They are very passionate, very competent, very capable leaders, and it is a privilege to have them with us here today. So I know that Precious did a really good job introducing them, but I do just want to pause here to see if Latoya and Ken would like to share anything else about themselves as a way of introduction before we jump into our panel. And then also with the panel, we encourage you to, of course, use the chat box to ask any questions you may have. We do have some scripted questions, but we want you to get the most out of the session. So if there's something that comes to mind based on the comments that I shared or anything that they share, please use that chat function. So I'm going to stop there. Latoya?
Hi, yes, thank you, Whitney. Appreciate the opportunity to be with y'all today. So I am Latoya. I use she, her pronouns. I serve as the executive director of DEI at Davenport University. We have several campuses throughout the state of Michigan. So Warren, Detroit, Lansing, Midland, and I'm based out of the Grand Rapids campus. So have the opportunity to work with folks at all of those places across the state, and excited to be here. Whitney had asked if we would share just a little bit in our introductions of why we chose to work in DEI. So as I reflected on that, really came to the answer that I didn't, that I would say DEI chose me. My career path has largely been influenced just by my own life experiences, particularly as a student working in higher ed, I think, reflecting on how that shaped where I am today. My first job as an undergrad student was working in, back then it was called Minority Affairs Office, but a multicultural type affairs office, coordinating college visits for students of color. And I don't know that I thought about it in that context at the time, but reflecting back on that, knowing that part of what was my draw to that position was during high school, me and too many other Black and Brown students were never really talked to about the importance of or the opportunity to take AP courses or why you should go on a campus visit to figure out if an institution is a good fit for you. And so I was really drawn to work for a program that not only acknowledge the inequity in preparing students and certain students for college and giving the same information around financial aid and college prep courses to take that other students would receive and that I saw play out in my high school experience, but it was doing something about it. It was a grant funded program that I don't think is around anymore. And that really resonated with me. So I carry that same passion with me today. What I love about my current role and working particularly with college students is being able to influence the way in which they develop their craft. I had the opportunity to present to a health professions class this morning and get excited about walking alongside and the opportunity to help shape and establish while students are establishing themselves as professionals, but doing it through a DEI lens rather than, I've also been a consultant and worked with folks who are established in their roles for 15, 20 years, say as practicing nurses or business folks, and helping them at that point kind of think through how and why this is relevant. I love the opportunity to be able to do that, both for in-classroom and out-of-classroom experiences as students are developing their craft. So that's what excites me. I'm excited to share more about my experiences with y'all today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Latoya. Now I'll turn things over to Ken to introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everyone. I saw there was over 170 people at one point in time on. Just on my screen, a couple of people I've met before or worked with. And for those of you, I'm saying hello. And for those of you I'm meeting for the first time, saying hello, my name is Ken. My pronouns are he, him. And I am the inaugural Chief Diversity Officer at Muskegon Community College. I've been there 1 year this week. And very excited because I'm going from the visionary phase to the implementation phase. But I've been advancing diversity, equity, inclusion for almost 30 years in a number of industries, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure to do this in a higher ed setting. A couple of things that I wanted to share with you is one, I am an executive certified diversity coach. So I do bring in the lens of coaching to my diversity, equity, inclusion experiences. And why DEI? So of course, when you hear me say DEI, that's diversity, equity, inclusion, and that includes social justice, that includes belonging initiatives when I say that. But for me, I like to lead things better than I found it. And so over my career, I started out as a municipal worker and I ended up doing equal opportunity and affirmative action. And that's where the passion came for me, creating initiatives where we could initiate cross-cultural dialogues, where we could find solutions to problems. And sometimes it was just exposure. We didn't know this was existing because there was no exposure there, or we needed to bridge the gap. So that has been my mantra going forward, is just making things better than I found it. That's through communication, policy development, advancement of career opportunities, so on and so forth. So I will pause there and say I'm excited to be a part of this. And the one thing I want to offer before we get into question and answers is I am honored and would be happy to share with you my tips, whether you're a DEI practitioner and you're looking for ways to advance this in your organization. I tend to not say buy-in, but to create that shared movement of moving things forward. We have tips there, or maybe you're looking to get started. I've had the privilege of kickstarting diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives in a number of industries. So if there's some questions around that, please let me know. I'm happy to share with you what my experience has been. Thank you.
Perfect. You are both a wealth of knowledge and resources, which is why I'm excited to have you here. So now I want to start out with the panel questions by making some connections to the DEI guidebook and the competencies that I just walked through. So we just started out with personal characteristics. And my first question is, based on those personal characteristics in the guidebook, it's on page 26 if you may have it open in front of you, but which personal characteristic resonated the most with you and why? Like as a person trying to impact DEI in a positive way, which personal characteristics resonated with you and why?
All right. And I think you said you wanted me to kick us off on the first question. So my memory's kicking in. But with that, if you were ever to come to one of my trainings, you would hear me say a number of things. Use your discernment, and something that I would say is meeting people where they're at. So when you talk about having those personal characteristics, for me, my true north is meeting people where they're at. So in advancing DEI, I always look at things through a positive intent. People don't know what they don't know. And so I use my personal characteristics to meet people at where they're at. If someone is vulnerable enough with me to let me know what they don't know or where they have questions around. I don't stop the conversation there. I try to meet them where they're at and not make them feel guilty about not knowing something that sometimes they probably should know in the role that they have or what they're trying to do. So there are a number of personal characteristics, but I sum it up as being able to meet people where they're at. I have a professional poker face. And so what I mean by that, I've worked with some very high level individuals, and they'll come and say, Ken, tell me, what does this mean? And for the role that they have, that question to me doesn't align. They should know that. But if they were vulnerable enough with me to share that, I want to meet them there. So that's to lead with positive intent, to meet people where they're at. The work is challenging enough to make someone not want to ask questions in the future. So that's kind of been one of the ways that I use that characteristic is being able to meet people where they're at and still advance the work. And knowing that people are on different stages of the journey. Some people are on step one. Other people have been navigating something a little bit more complex and they need some assistance there. I meet them as well. The last thing that I'll share, and maybe LaToya wants to add to this, is I do this work and I know it must move forward. So there's an analogy that I use, and some of you may have heard this, but if you picture in your mind Old Faithful, where Yellowstone National Park, and people gather around and it erupts and there's something exciting, and then people go back to camping and looking at buffalo and all that. But also picture in your mind Niagara Falls, where you have the steady cascading waterfall that never ceases. When I work with individuals, whether it's internally or externally, I recommend that we have to do this work with the Niagara Falls approach, because it's challenging. You're going to uncover some things that have always been there, but you have to push forward. Whereas, and I'll use 2020 as an example, where we had Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, to say their names. And Ken, come in and talk to us about navigating conversations around race, and then check the box, and then you move on. That Old Faithful approach, I don't recommend that. I recommend the Niagara Falls approach. So thank you.
LaToya, did you want to add anything on?
Yeah, for me, I would say being self-aware is the characteristic that resonates the most. When I think about my own DEI journey, practicing self-awareness is doing the work. So if you have the little box that kind of outlines what all that looks like, I don't think you can be an impactful DEI leader and not be on a journey of exploring your own intersecting identities and what that means for how you navigate and show up in the world, what that means for how others see you and interact with you. I would say in our work, we should be modeling what we ask of others. So in the context of owning our biases is another talking point under that characteristic. So owning our biases, modeling, leaning into learning about and navigating the oppressive frameworks within which we've grown up. If our work includes, as Whitney pointed out, the distinction between equity and equality, if we're focused on that equity piece and breaking down barriers to equitable outcomes, then understanding and exploring how systems influence how we experience the world around us based on who we are is critical. So for me, I think that first characteristic listed there in being self-aware really encompasses so much of just modeling this work in ourselves for others. But I think that also then provides a platform for this characteristic of being self-aware, calling us to lean into some of the other characteristics that are listed there, right? So as folks see us doing the work, hopefully we're reflecting aspects of authenticity, and we're creating platforms to build connections and relationships with others, which again, are reflected in some of those other characteristics that are listed there. So that's, for me, being self-aware is key.
All right, so one of the second competencies that we talked about is knowledge. And of course, DEI is a very broad topic. You could go in many different directions when we talk about, getting started in this space, how do we build our knowledge? On page 33 of the guidebook, we have a list of topics for DEI training. Which one or two do you think is the most important for a person kind of just getting started in this space, whether they're a practitioner or not? What would you recommend that they learn more about? Ken?
Happy to share. In fact, I was refreshing my memory on this list, and one thing that I wrote down And I believe in the power of analogy and storytelling, if you haven't picked up on that. And for the knowledge piece, two things. One, you don't have to do this alone. So that's how I, break it down for me. You don't have to do this alone. And you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Now, you may have to adapt it to fit your organization, or that, but so you have allies in there. And when I say ally, there's a number of definitions. So ally, I have this big conversation coming up around DEI. An ally could be someone that you trust. Here's how I'm going to approach the conversation, and have them be candid with you. Yes, you should talk about that. No, you shouldn't talk about that. That's too soon, or that's too advanced. So one, I would say that's a form of allyship. The another form of allyship is, you know what, I've been trying to advance this and I've been hitting a lot of brick walls and I'm tired. I'm going to hand the baton to Whitney, and I'm going to take the weekend off and do some self-care. And Whitney's going to take it for a week, and then I'll come back and do this. So that's another form of allyship. And then the other thing is just reaching out to others. So I know it's listed in there. If someone has started something similar, again, whether you're just getting started or it's a new program or you're trying to take something further, I know I'm very open to, if you send me an email, say, hey, Ken, what's your opinion on this? And I do that for just the cost of a cup of coffee, because I love advancing this work. So when you think about your knowledge, you can leverage others in a way that helps you. That's what comes to mind for me. Number of things too, but I'll lead with that one.
All right, Latoya, based on the kind of list of topics that I'm screen sharing now, what would you recommend a person kind of revisit, research, gain some more insight on if they're just getting started in this space?
Yeah, honestly, I think it's dependent on a variety of factors. So I appreciate the list. I think it's comprehensive and touches on a lot of different aspects and can, again, be used to reflect individually. But I think it depends on where the organization is. So what is that culture? What work have they done in building capacity among their constituents? I think obviously it depends on where the individual is, but also the populations that you serve. So there may be immediate needs. For example, Davenport had an emphasis on military and veteran populations a few years back in training and building out training relative to that, because there were a growing number of students who were reporting a disconnect in how their peers or faculty understood or maybe didn't understand that aspect of their identity as they navigated campus. And so I think there are a lot of factors that go into what might be the most important topics for a DEI practitioner. Obviously, starting out, I think it's important for anyone to establish some common language on what this means for your organization. So starting out could be the position's new. Ken talked about his inaugural role, right, to the organization. It could be an established position. So I stepped in as the second person for our university. So it had been established for about 7 years, and then a new person coming in, but establishing that common language for what your organization is committed to. Maybe it's diversity and inclusion, and equity is not a piece of that yet. For Davenport, it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. Other folks use different terminology at their organizations. So we have that language reflected in our value statements. We have that in the sessions for onboarding new employees, where they'll sit through a session with me to really break down what does DEI mean here at Davenport and how we expect that to kind of show up and influence behaviors and competencies and interactions across campus. So beyond that, again, I think it can depend on what's happening at a national or local level. So when I was in my first few months, I started at Davenport in 2020. So all of the events and the names that Ken read out, all of that was happening in my first few weeks and months at Davenport. And I remember I had someone reach out to me who our training department wanted to do something, right? You had all of these kind of racialized incidents that were happening, from Ahmaud Arbery to Breonna Taylor to George Floyd, and the training department wanted to do something. And so they asked if I would partner on an implicit bias training. And again, that was like a specific response to what was happening at a national level that was kind of infiltrating some internal conversations, and maybe some ways to support to do better. So I think I'm avoiding your question, but because I think it can be related to so many different pieces and dependent on so many different aspects of who's doing the work, who your constituents are, where the organization is, and we should be purposeful and intentional to take all those things into consideration in shaping what are our priorities.
It's 100% fine that you avoided the question in your words, because that's the important thing here, that we have to treat everything on a case-by-case basis. Our interactions with people, the communications we send, just understanding that everybody is at a different place. So that was a really good response, actually. My next question is related to those brave conversations. Ken and Latoya both touched on some instances of police brutality over the years, some unjust killings of Black and brown people. And of course, that will, of course, spark some tension, right, in the workplace, but then also some need or desire to have conversations, because when those incidents happen, we can't expect our colleagues to show up to work or our students to show up just, with 100% normal mindset, positive, let's get things done. Like, it's emotionally heavy, it's secondary trauma, it's going to lead to a conversation. So Ken and Latoya, my question for you is, what tips do you have? What tips do you have to have brave conversations about these topics in the workplace, whether it's race or something else? Like, what are your top 2 tips?
I can go first. I would say my experience in navigating tensions or difficult conversations is really to focus on the organization's mission. That we are all part of the same team, committed to a shared vision, shared values. I've navigated some kind of tensions related to DEI work, advancing DEI practices, or even just having conversations around DEI that got very difficult in K-12 settings. You can imagine the different opinions that were represented there, nonprofit, with some board service that I've been on, obviously in college settings as well. And I always center the conversation around how is what we're doing related, or we want to do related to DEI, how is that relevant to the mission of this organization? And that's always been helpful. We shouldn't be engaging in work that is not relevant to our mission. And on the flip side, if DEI is relevant to achieving our mission, which you can probably determine my bias, I think it's relevant to everything, and there isn't a mission it wouldn't be connected to. But if we determine that it is, then we need to be about that work. And if it takes it from being Latoya's agenda, which I've been accused of before on a college campus of advancing Latoya's agenda, to it being, this is mission critical, right? If we say our mission is to provide education for all students, that's my hook for DEI. What do we mean by all, right? It's related to any organization's mission, but to go through the work of centering it around that, for me, when I was working with a K-12 system, a superintendent had called me and reached out to me. They'd been doing some work with students around DEI, participating in conversations and doing some, looking at the school, what are some things they could do to make the school more inclusive. They were getting pushback from parents, from a speaker that they brought to share some ideas. And that was really the center of the question is, why did you engage? Why do you have this student group? Why did you bring in this keynote speaker? And they walked back from that, well, they had determined this group based on an aspect of one of the goals for the year, and that goal was related to the mission. And as we walked it back, could very clearly see the line from mission to that specific event and initiative. And it was like a light bulb went off in that superintendent's head that I didn't think about, right? The fact that we've done the purposeful work to make sure that this is relevant to what we're about. And was able to then use that in communicating in those conversations where he was receiving pushback. So centering it on the organization's mission, at least for me, has been really helpful.
Thank you for that, Latoya. Having, conversations. So one, I'll say with this, we always talk about having that safe space. And so there are layers to my answer. And so leading for DEI related conversations, I will tell people the space is safe, meaning we can be vulnerable. But I try to say this is a brave space. because it might not be comfortable. Comfort and safe are not synonymous. So when we lead with the DEI, we lead with the DEI conversation, this is a brave space, but we might get uncomfortable in there. So we have that ground rule. The other analogy that I'll give you, and this is from a former boss of mine, but he always used to use this analogy, and I've carried it with me for DEI work. If any of you have ever been to or seen a greyhound race on TV, they send that rabbit out and all the dogs start chasing the rabbit. If the rabbit gets too far ahead of the dogs, they'll actually stop chasing it. And so when I think about DEI, depending on where we're at as an organization, that determines the pace of the rabbit, if you will, because we can start too deep with certain people. So I'm just saying, as we use our discernment, what is this conversation centered around? The other thing is that I'm mindful of, you might not agree. So you can be civil and disagree. So I also use this mantra when I'm having a discussion around a DEI related topic. We're going to have dialogue, discourse, and dissemination of information. I stay away from debate and argument. And if we get to a point where we agree to disagree, or if someone is now seeing something for the first time the way they haven't seen it, I want to allow time for that person to come to the new realization. That may require a break or a second meeting, depending on the topic. So that's the thing. And then also, when you get to a point where there might be some difficult conversations, the power of open-ended questions, not to forget that. So if you're in a meeting and people are not understanding what you're talking about, it's already a very volatile topic, and someone says something offensive, tell me more about that. You strike me as a fair-minded person when you say something like that. You're being very discriminatory. What do you mean? Or is that what you intended to say? So that's kind of my take. Just remember, the space can be brave and there might be some discomfort, but we need to move forward with that. Debate and argument don't change much. That's why I go with discourse, dialogue, and dissemination of information. It's okay to agree to disagree, or it's okay to pause to allow someone to get their brain around something new. And then if it gets to a point, don't forget about the power of open-ended questions.
Right. Thank you. Sometimes it's a challenge to get yourself off mute. So one of my next questions is around collaboration. So collaboration is, of course, a theme of the guidebook. How do you engage with other organizational colleagues or leaders, maybe people in different departments, to help them understand their role in DEI and to get them to contribute? Because some people may feel it's not my job, it's not my responsibility. I'm not the DEI officer. I'm not in leadership. So how do you help them see the connection?
I can jump in. I would say that is very true. There's always going to be some folks who think either it's not their role, and sometimes I'm probably there isn't a week that doesn't go by that I say, well, LaToya can't own everything that touches DEI because I'm one person. That's it. That's the office. It's me. And we've really set up a strategy at Davenport that DEI will be institutionalized, so it's everyone's work. And my role is really more facilitating that lens development. How am I helping build capacity for folks to do their role or enhance the ways in which they do their role through a DEI lens? So there absolutely will be folks. And sometimes it's coming from a place of, again, just not understanding how DEI is connected to their role. So I'm thinking about taking steps. It's a journey, inviting folks into the process where they are, working from within a department. So if I think about some leaders that's been the case, kind of infiltrating their department, are there team members that I can pull into the DEI council service or a project that I'm working on to help raise awareness of their team? And then that has kind of bubbled up from there. So there's more folks building allies. As a new professional, I was quickly introduced to the politics that are sometimes reflected in the letters that I do not have behind my name. So I do not have a PhD. Was once told I could not facilitate a training session for a department because I didn't have a PhD and wasn't qualified to do so. I've been really purposeful in pulling in faculty members to join me in this work, because the truth of the matter is there are spaces where faculty voices, where white voices, where older voices carry more weight than mine. It's not fair, but it's reality, and allies have been an important component and partnership in those spaces. So that's what I would lead with.
Thank you, Latoya. A couple of things just to say. I just kind of was perusing the chat that was there, and thank you for correcting us, assess, being facetious out there. But one of the things that I wanted to say, there was a question about the Council on the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education, and how do you align these things? And so I kind of want to answer that question. And then there was a question about, when I use that Greyhound analogy, you know, what are some best practices if the Greyhounds start to slow down, and to do that. So I'll address the CAS standards first. My approach to that is, you know, kind of, if you build it, they will come, you know, just using that analogy. So we have to say, this is our why. We're leading with DEI. And so I'm using Muskegon Community College as an example. And I've had faculty say to me, some of the initiatives that we're starting, that seems a lot like hand-holding. And I want to do the mindset shift and say, we talk about the students that we impact. You talk about students being able to meet the rigors of the class. We talk about a number of things. So if we're putting programs in place that eliminate barriers for students so that they can be successful in the classroom, that's not hand-holding. Shift the mind a little bit. That's elimination of barriers so we can have greater student outcomes, better student outcomes. And so that's kind of my thing. And those things align with your CAS standards. What we're doing is, you know, we talk about, and again, using MCC, oh, we get these students come in and the retention rates from fall to fall are going down. Well, if we got programs in place that are helping that, isn't that a way where we can still implement our standards? So I think there has to be education around a mindset shift. The other thing about is using your discernment in your assessment. So in your specific organizations, there's a pace for advancing DEI, whether that's, again, baby steps or you're taking larger strides. So use your discernment. If you're leading with something and you're getting more traction, more buy-in, more revenue, then that's probably a good pace, using a very high-level example. But if you're implementing things and you start to see activities wane, people having more questions than trying to implement something, then that might be a chance for you to slow down the pace of that rabbit, to make sure everyone has a chance to catch up. So that's without being too specific and not knowing what's happening in your respective organizations, that's how I would address that. You know, this is the why, going back to the CAS standards of what we're doing. And if we are retaining folks and they're successful, that aligns with the standards we're trying to do that lead toward graduation. And then for initiatives that you're trying to implement, you know, if people are on board and you see more traction, more participation, and then that's probably a good sign you're doing the right pace.
All right, thank you, Ken. So we do.
Whitney, I'm sorry. Ken, there was another question that came through the chat. Can you finish the statement you made regarding dialogue and discourse? What was the next step?
It's my 3Ds: dialogue, discourse, and dissemination of information. Dialogue, discourse, and dissemination of information. I couple that with, I don't debate, I don't argue. Even if we can be cordial and agree to disagree through that dialogue, discourse, and dissemination of information.
Precious, are there any other questions that you may have received for the panelists?
Yes. In the guidebook, there's an appendix that has a list of ways that individuals can continue to grow their knowledge base, with a list of books that individuals can read. I'm curious, Ken and Latoya, if you could share one or two of your must-read books to our participants.
I'm actually looking around. I might have a copy. Well, one, you have a fine guidebook that Whitney authored that I think is a fine reading tool. But I believe in the power of grassroots dialogue, because sometimes it's just, I didn't see something the way that you saw it, and then how do we find consensus? So Uncomfortable Conversations with the Black Man by Emmanuel Acho, I think, is a good read to start that discussion. You know, just to say, hey, wow, we kind of in the same world, but we have two different interpretations of what we see. And so I think that that's a good book to start some cross-cultural dialogue.
Oh, I cringe at these types of questions. It's like asking me to pick a favorite food or song, and I can't. So I'll name, and I'll drop in the chat the one that's next to my bedside right now, which is Coaching for Equity. I think, you know, again, it kind of depends on what you're looking to do, where you're at. But it's hard to name, you know, a few specific that are, there's some really good resources out there. So I'll drop in the chat the one that's next to my bedside right now. But I'm terrible at these type of questions because I get the same thing when someone asks me to pick my favorite song. I'm like, I don't know, what genre are we talking about? Like what bucket of DEI are we talking about here? There are things, you know, related to teaching and so many different aspects. So sorry, I'm not helping.
Well, and I'll echo that because I have a bookcase that has several DEI specific books that I've read, and then you start running through the Rolodex and it's hard to pick one. But I wanted to offer this, you know, when we talk about advancing DEI and I said using your discernment, I'll give you just a real quick story. I started a book club discussion in a previous employer, which was a great thing. However, there wasn't a foundation. We started too deep. That's the point I'm making. So when you think about these books and where they're at, when you think about introducing them to others, remember everybody is on different stages of the journey. I gave you that analogy. And so even though I'm a big proponent of the book, Dr. Ibram Kendi's book, which of course I said his name and now I'm drawing a blank on the title. Someone help me, Dr. Ibram Kendi.
Is it like stamped, but from the beginning?
Not stamped, which I've read. It's oh my gosh, this is embarrassing. But Dr. Ibram Kendi has a book that we use for a book study.
How to Be Anti-Racist. Someone put in the chat.
That's
Deborah
it, How to
Armstrong.
Be
Is it that one?
Thank you. I have read that book. But the organization I was in at the time, even though my intention was very positive, not everyone in the organization was ready to embrace the concepts in that book. And if I had it to do over, I would have started with the book that was a little bit more introductory. So think about that. When I say pacing in your organization, I am all about advancing DEI, but it can derail things if you go too fast, too soon, or if you make the wrong person uncomfortable or alienated, or they can't embrace it. So that's part of these competencies in doing this. So even though I'm a proponent of that book, that might not be the best place to start. It might be a book that's a little bit more introductory until you get a foundation and can move forward. So I wanted to just give you that lesson learned.
We had another great question that came through the chat in that as we're doing this DEI work, sometimes it can become this us versus them, or the believer, the champion of DEI work, and the non-believer and the one who's not yet engaged in this work. How do we build our togetherness and come together as we are all on, it's a journey, right? Whitney, I appreciate you sharing that in the guidebook, that this is a journey that we're all on. And so the non-believer and the believer are on journeys. How do we merge the two paths? Is that possible?
It is. I mean, I've seen it. I've seen it done. Being willing to invest in this work is investing in people and their journeys, because we're all at different places. So I've worked with folks who our first interactions were like, whoa. And the ways in which, again, I think that why I gravitated so much to that characteristic of kind of that self-awareness piece is because that provided a platform to build connection across those differences. I mean, there's just so much at play, and never writing someone off, regardless of what that first interaction might be or a comment that they might say, because people will surprise you. Sometimes it takes you being vulnerable and sharing a growth area that you've had that creates that safest place for them to ask questions and lean in. Sometimes it's having an incident in class. I've gotten cold calls from faculty that was like, whoa, I did something in class today. This happened. Can you please help me? I am in over my head, who before had never reached out, right? It became relevant to them by happenstance. And so again, folks that maybe stereotypically you might write off because you've seen that behavior before and you've tried building those connections and relationships. So for me, I try to operate from a place of also just humility in that, like, I've been doing this work for years and still don't know everything. And so the only way I can continue to grow and enhance even as an individual is to be in community with others who are committed to learning and leaning in. And so I am grateful for the ways in which folks that have invested in my growth and development. And I owe that as just a way to pay it forward to others. It can be painful sometimes to walk that journey. Folks aren't moving maybe as fast as you want them to. But I'm thinking about some successes that I've had even recently and invested, 2 years into a relationship and a process, and the fruits that I'm seeing from that labor that are directly connected to some outcomes that are exceeding our goals related to some of the goals that we've had around our employees. It's a beautiful process. It's complicated, but I hope that maybe that question was picking up on some comments that we had said, that we weren't presenting a situation where that's the way that we view this. Diversity means all of us. And even those difficult voices that constantly sit in that devil's advocate type place in my council meetings, I appreciate them. It makes our DEI work more meaningful. It's a broader approach that is pulling more folks into the conversations and advancing into aspects of the institution that we wouldn't otherwise reach if we only stayed with folks who from day one were bought in and passionate and excited and had the energy to do this work. So
Beautifully worded, Latoya. Thank you so much. The picture that I got in my mind, speaking of analogies, Ken, is a seed. It's in dirt and it looks like it's not going to sprout. It's dark, it's messy, it's cold, it's wet when it rains, but out of nowhere, without any prompting from anyone, it sprouts and it grows. So we never know what small nugget that we'll share with someone in a conversation when we choose to be vulnerable and lead with positive intent, what that's going to water and allow to grow in another person. So beautifully said. There was another question. How do you keep from getting stuck between that planning phase and that leading phase? How do we choose to be brave and do it knowing that we might make some mistakes along the way?
I'll take the first attempt at this question. One, I'm a big proponent. I know every organization has their reality and funding and to do this. If it can be, something is better than nothing, but there needs to be a leader around diversity, equity, and inclusion in every organization. And I know that's easier said than done. And then if there's someone that has budget and responsibility and influence ability as part of that. And I want to tie this into the one question that I saw a moment ago in the chat about how do you get others to come on board and to do this. So sharing of metrics and data, but also rethinking your mindset. So Whitney gave you very good advice about celebrating the small wins. And you'll never hear Ken minimize advancing diversity, equity, inclusion to a potluck. But if we can always bring people together, and food seems to work. So if there is a themed month that you want to center around or celebrating, something to bring people together, then once you have like-minded people together, you can talk about what is the next step, of this organization. So a way to kind of build some synergy and some momentum, around that is one of my recommendations. And then also coming to the mindset shift, a lot of times, and I've worked with a lot of CEOs and CFOs and CHROs that didn't quite get the connection of DEI to how it helps the culture in an organization. And sometimes and feel free to steal this, for people that are bottom line driven, the easiest thing to measure is turnover. And if you have a culture, so, recruitment, without retention is ineffective, in my opinion. But if you can address turnover through better culture, that's a return on investment right there. But that comes with culture. So a lot of people say, and I asked this hypothetical question, a lot of organizations say, oh, we want a workforce that mirrors our constituent base, or we want a workforce that mirrors the community that we're in. Very noble. However, ask yourself hypothetically, if you had a workforce that mirrored your community, would you be able to retain that workforce? That's where the culture comes in. So I just wanted to say, those things are very much there. Then also, if the biggest bottom line in 99% of organizations is what you spend on salaries and fringe benefits. And to do that, so if you're $1 million organization and you spend $600,000 a year on salaries and benefits, that's your people, your resource, your bottom line. Why do you want to spend $2,000 a year on DEI? So rethinking your mindset shift, if that's your most valuable asset, and we know that culture impacts retention and productivity, why wouldn't you invest more than that? But that takes a mindset shift. And so that's kind of my answer to the question that you had.
Can I jump in a second? There was a question in the chat around being advised not to create a DEI specific position because DEI should be everyone's responsibility. And I don't mean to laugh at that in like an offensive way. I just have navigated that in other institutions and it sounds very familiar. I think for me, when I think about, technically recruiting students is everyone's responsibility. The experience they have in the classroom is tied to who we're able to admit, right? It's also the experience you have in programming, the student services side, right? How much do you have Greek Light, right? What are those opportunities for students to engage is indirectly tied to who we can admit. The same thing with retention. Retention is everyone's work, but we absolutely have people on our campuses who are responsible for setting a strategy, pulling data, and paying attention to both retention numbers and admissions numbers. And if it is important to the institution, my response is that you need a leader on campus that is ensuring there is a strategy and there is an approach and there is momentum behind advancing DEI, whatever your values, principles, and strategy is, and working to equip folks who work at your institution and folks who attend as students with the competencies and the lenses to be able to do the work that they do through a DEI lens. So that would be my response to, obviously I'm biased because this is my role, but I think there absolutely needs to be, and we wouldn't hear people say that about, well, admissions is everyone's work, retention is everyone's work, so we don't need a leader on campus for that particular bucket, but somehow we use that mentality for DEI.
And we've heard it before. When I was interviewing people for the guidebook, there was a comment made, and I really like the example they used where I was interviewing Abe Carrillo, and he said that's essentially like saying, we don't need a CFO. It's everybody's job to be fiscally responsible. And that analogy always stuck with me because it's very true that we all have a role to play in this, but you still need a leader to be accountable, to be the person like implementing the strategy, to be the go-to person, the specialist who can provide resources and things like that at the end of the day. So thank you, Latoya. I do just have one kind of wrap up slide before we transition into our networking session. First off, I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you for your engagement. Thank you for your time and attention. Thank you to Ken and Latoya for being excellent panelists. I knew you would be. Of course, I learned something from you every time. I think the audience really appreciated the session too, because the questions are still coming in. So I want you all to know that Latoya, Ken, and I are actually going to stay on for the networking portion, where you'll still have some time to engage with them and to ask some of those questions in the next, 17 minutes that we have together here. But before I go, I did want to share with you all that in the guidebook, there is an action plan, so you can do some self-reflection and decide what you want your next steps to be. But then there's also that appendix that includes all of those book recommendations like Ken had mentioned. And you can actually download a free copy of this guidebook if you desire at this TALNet website. Or if you prefer a hard copy, it can be purchased on Amazon as well. So we encourage you to keep the conversation going, share this information with anyone else within your network who may need it. But I also wanted to mention that last year, we hosted a series of workshops where we did a deeper dive, an hour-and-a-half session on all 5 competencies in the guidebook. So if you're passionate about this work, you think you could benefit from learning more, they are available on YouTube. So you'll have all this information when the session concludes. And with that being said, I'll turn things back over to Precious.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I'm so happy that the questions are still coming through the chat. You can continue to share those questions with your peers in our networking portion. But before we get to that portion of our time together this afternoon, I did want to share the other sessions that we're going to have this week. The first one is our policy and politics session that's going to be held tomorrow. We would love to see all of you. During this session, we're going to talk about, it's a big election year for Michigan. And so all of the intricacies that we should be aware of and have top of mind are going to be shared, as well as the new MCCA strategic plan. On Thursday, September 22nd, same time, same place, we're going to have another conversation centered around reimagining the learner experience. And so we're going to talk about our student success projects and the ways in which our student success activities intersect with one another for the betterment of student success. And then we'll end Friday talking about my workforce pathways, new tools for student success. So I do highly recommend that everyone attend each session. Whether you attend all of the sessions or just a couple or just today, I do hope that everyone would feel comfortable sharing their experience with us in our session evaluation. The way that you can do this is either going to that direct link or using your cell phone camera, turning on the camera on your cell phone, placing it in front of the screen, and an evaluation link is going to automatically upload on your cell phone. And you can submit your session evaluation there. We do value your feedback, and we look at every response because we are committed to making these interactions and convenings as effective and beneficial to our members as possible. So please share your evaluation. Now we are going to segue into our speed networking portion. I understand that some have other commitments this afternoon, but for those who miss in-person convenings, miss having those coffee conversations or getting that last chocolate chip cookie at the session summit, this opportunity is for you. And so I encourage you to stick around. We are going to jump into our speed networking portion. Thank you, Whitney, Ken, and LaToya, for sharing your time and participating in this with us. We would love to have you. Erica is going to break us out into our breakout rooms momentarily. The way that this is going to work is we're going to have 3 to 4 individuals in each breakout room. And there's going to be questions that you can ask in your breakout room. I'm going to populate those questions in the chat so that all of you have them. You are going to participate in 2 different breakout rooms with different individuals to give you an opportunity to interact with your peers across the state and across the country, because we have individuals from all over joining us today. Following the speed networking portion, you will be free to go, but we do welcome you to stick around and come back tomorrow during our next summit session. Any questions about how we're going to navigate this next portion of our session? Okay, I'm going to take silence as I have done my job in sharing all the information that's needed. I'm going to turn things over to Erica to break us up into our breakout rooms.
All right, thank you so much, Precious, and thank you so much to Whitney, Ken, and LaToya, and Precious for coordinating this session. It was excellent. So for those of you who are still with us,